Hello, insomniacs, fellow night owls. Or maybe you're an overnight driver, maybe security somewhere, or at the plant. Anyone pulling the graveyard. Welcome to the night shift. The winter air felt like a living thing that morning, biting into every exposed inch of skin. In the small town of Pine Ridge, Wisconsin, the residents had braced themselves for the worst, yet nothing could truly prepare them for the ferocity of this cold. It was the coldest winter day of the year, a day that would etch itself into the memory of every person who survived it. The sun hadn't shown itself for days. The sky was a pale, washed-out gray, a permanent veil of clouds that seemed to press down on the earth. Snowdrifts had piled high against the town's old wooden buildings, their surfaces coated in layers of ice. The wind howled through the streets, a cruel, biting force that cut through the thickest of jackets and scarves. Inside the homes of Pine Ridge, the warmth of wood stoves and central heat was a precious commodity. But even in the warmth of their living rooms, the chill of the outside world would seep in, a reminder that cold was never truly far away. People huddled by the fire, silently aware that the weather had become something more than just a seasonal shift. It was a force of nature, unpredictable and unyielding. At the edge of town, at the top of a hill, where the old mill stood, now abandoned and frozen in time, a lone figure trudged through the snow. Emma Hale, a young woman in her late 20s, moved with purpose, despite the cold that bit at her face and hands. She was used to this, used to the harsh winters that made life in the north a constant struggle, but today was different. Today the cold was something else. As she approached the mill, she paused and glanced at the sky. The wind had picked up, a swirling gust that nearly knocked her off balance. It was as though the world itself was shifting. The old mill, once a symbol of the town's prosperity, now stood like a skeleton in the snow, its roof sagging under the weight of the snow and its windows dark and empty. Emma's father had worked at that mill. It was the reason they moved to Pine Ridge when she was a child. But after his sudden passing last year, the mill had closed its doors for good, leaving behind nothing but a hollow memory. Emma, however, wasn't here for nostalgia. She was here because there was something she needed to do. A town-wide emergency had been declared earlier that morning. Power outages, collapsed trees, and blocked roads made it possible for anyone to leave their homes. She had to get to the mill to check on something. Inside the old building, the temperature dropped even further. It was colder than she had anticipated, and it settled right into her bones. As she made her way through the dark, crumbling hallways, the only sound was the creaking of the wooden beams above her head. Her breath was visible in the frigid air, clouding in front of her face with each exhale. She'd reached the main office at the heart of the mill when she'd heard it. The faintest sound of a whistle, a strange, almost eerie noise in the otherwise silent building. Emma froze. Her eyes scanned the room, every nerve alert, her heart pounding in her chest. The welled again, and suddenly the door behind her slammed shut. She spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the relentless cold and the silence. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out, thankful for the distraction. A message from her best friend Hannah appeared on the screen. "It's too dangerous. Don't stay there too long. They're saying it's going to get worse." Emma swallowed hard, her fingers numb from the cold, but she had no choice. The mill had to be secured before nightfall, before the weather got even worse. Ben Thorne, the town sheriff, had seen many storms come and go in Pine Ridge, but none like this. He stood in his office, staring at the map of the town sprawled across his desk, his brow furrowed in concentration. The power had gone out hours ago. The roads were becoming impassable with every gust of wind. The snow continued to pile higher, closing off the only route into and out of town. And if that wasn't enough, the radio had crackled to life with reports of dangerous wind chills approaching -50. He grabbed his jacket, pulling it tightly around his shoulders. It wasn't just the cold that was his concern, it was the people. The elderly, the young families in the farthest reaches of Pine Ridge, those who depended on the small town's fragile infrastructure to stay alive. His first priority was to get out there and make sure everyone was safe. As Ben stepped out into the wind, the cold slammed into him like a wall. The streets were deserted. No one in their right mind would be out here today. His boots crunched through the snow as he made his way to the patrol car. The engine sputtered before roaring to life, and the thought of driving anywhere in these conditions made his stomach turn. He knew his old truck wouldn't make it to the farthest homes. He reached for the radio, calling in for backup. "This is Sheriff Thorne," he said, his voice rough with effort of shouting over the wind. "Need a crew to head out to the east side. We've got several reports of downed trees and power's out all over town. If anyone's in trouble, we need to be prepared." The radio crackled in response. "Roger that, Sheriff. We're on our way." Ben nodded, gripping the wheel harder. He didn't know how many calls they would get today, how many people might need help. The storm wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a reminder of how quickly nature could take control, how fragile their world really was. Hannah Green, the local nurse, wasn't surprised to see the waiting room at Pine Ridge's small clinic packed. People were already showing up with frostbite, numbed fingers, and feet too cold to feel. Others had slipped on icy sidewalks and driveways or gotten stuck in their vehicles, making their way in for a warm place to wait. The clinic was one of the few places that still had power, thanks to the backup generators. It hummed steadily in the corner, but even with the lights on, the chill in the air was undeniable. Hannah worked efficiently, moving from one patient to the next. She'd seen this kind of thing before. Cold creeping up on people in small doses until it was too late, until they were already frozen to the bone. She could feel the weight of the responsibility press on her shoulders as she wrapped another set of bandages around another patient's frostbitten hand. She looked up at the clock on the wall, 2 p.m. It felt later, the days blending together under the grayness of the storm. She wondered how Emma was doing. Her best friend had mentioned something about checking on the mill, but the power was out. She hadn't heard from her. Hannah grabbed her phone, firing off a text. "Let me know if you're okay." No response. Her stomach twisted. She took a deep breath, returning to her duties, but the worry lingered, gnawing at her. Peter and Mary Thompson, a married couple in their early 60s, lived in the farthest house from the center of town, a modest farmhouse nestled on a rise near the woods. The drive into town was treacherous on that day, on any day, but today was nearly impossible. Peter had spent the morning trying to keep the wood stove stoked, but the wind had blown the chimney pipe loose, and now the fire was struggling to stay alive. Inside, the house was unbearably cold, and the gusts of wind that whistled through the cracks in the walls seemed to mock their efforts to stay warm. Mary, bundled in blankets and wearing 2 layers of woolen socks, had been pacing the living room, her eyes darting toward the windows. Every time the wind howled, she'd flinch. "We need to get to town, Peter," she said. "We need to get to the clinic, at least until the storm passes. I'm worried the pipes are going to freeze, and we're not safe here." Peter was shaking his head as he fiddled with the stove's dampers. "Mary, I can't. It's too dangerous. We'd never make it down that hill in this weather." But Mary was persistent. "I don't want to wait around and freeze to death while you try to fix that stove. We've got to do something." Peter sighed, his breath clouding in the cold air. He'd seen enough blizzards in his life to know when it was better to hunker down, but Mary's urgency couldn't be ignored. They had to do something. They had to reach the clinic before things got worse. He grabbed his jacket and they bundled up, ready to brave the storm. The wind had picked up even more, and it was becoming a wall of snow, making it almost impossible to see more than a few feet in front of them. As they stepped outside, Mary's eyes widened at the sight before her. The storm had intensified so quickly, it was as if the world had swallowed them whole, a sea of white swirling around them. "Stay close," Peter said, grabbing her arm. "We'll move slow. We've made it through worse." But as they took their first steps toward the road, Mary felt a pang of fear. The world around them was already disappearing under the snow. She wasn't sure they would make it. Rick Thompson, the local mechanic, the tinker man, had been working non-stop in his garage for the past 12 hours. The phone hadn't stopped ringing, each call bringing more bad news. Cars stuck on the side of the road, trucks unable to make it through the snowbanks, and people calling in because they hadn't realized just how quickly the cold could cripple their vehicles. Rick had always been the reliable one in town, the guy who could fix anything, but today, there was only so much he could do. The garage was full of cars waiting to be repaired, but with no way to safely get them out, he had no choice but to keep them inside, hoping the weather would break, but deep down, he knew the storm was far from over. The wind screamed against the windows of the garage, rattling the panes, and outside the snow continued to fall in heavy sheets, and Rick could see the visibility was dropping by the minute. The streets were now nearly deserted, the small town feeling more like a ghost town with each passing hour. The only signs of life were the occasional emergency vehicle moving slowly through the snow-drifted streets, their lights flashing like distant beacons. Rick grabbed a hot cup of coffee, sipping it carefully, watching as a few of the other mechanics huddled around a space heater in the corner, trying to stay warm. The power had gone out at the garage too, and the backup generator had kicked in, but it wasn't enough to make the whole place comfortable. "We're stuck here for the night, aren't we?" one of the mechanics asked. Rick nodded. "Yeah, looks like. Hopefully the roads clear up tomorrow, but I don't see that happening anytime soon." A loud bang at the back of the garage. The guys jumped. Rick's heart rate quickened. The storm was pushing everything to its limit. He could feel the weight of the town's isolation pressing in, and all he wanted was to make sure everyone was safe. He quickly grabbed his coat and walked outside. The cold slapped him across the face. There was no mistaking it now. The wind chill was nearly unbearable, and the storm was picking up speed. He looked out over the town, the snow swirling in chaotic patterns, and his thoughts immediately turned to his family. Where was his brother, Peter, and his wife, Mary? The Thompsons lived on the outskirts of town, and in this weather, he knew there was a good chance they'd be struggling. He pulled out his phone, his fingers stiff from the cold, and sent a quick text. "Check in when you can. Hope you're okay." Then he turned and made his way back inside, wondering just how many other people in town were facing the same dangerous conditions. Back at the clinic, Hannah's nerves were fraying. The makeshift waiting room was crowded, and there was little to be done except offer blankets and warm drinks. With the power outages stretching on, she had to conserve medical supplies and energy. The clinic only had so many resources, and she could tell that things were about to get a lot worse. She went from patient to patient, checking vitals, wrapping up frostbitten extremities, and offering pain relief for those who had been outside too long. "Don't go out there," she said to an elderly woman who had arrived. Her cheeks were reddened from exposure. "Stay here. The roads are blocked, and we can help you until the storm passes." The woman nodded weakly, her hands shaking in Hannah's, and the nurse's heart ached. There was a coldness that was more than physical. Fear was setting in. She stepped into the back room to check the generator, but as she did, her phone buzzed in her pocket, and it was a message from Emma. "I'm okay, at the mill, just need to finish up. Be home soon, stay safe." Relief washed over her, but worry didn't fade. The mill was far from the clinic, and the roads were nearly impassable. Emma was a strong woman, but the storm could overwhelm even the toughest person. Hannah's thoughts were interrupted as a loud crash sounded outside the clinic's front door. She rushed to the window and looked out. A large branch had fallen, blocking the entrance. Her pulse quickened. She couldn't leave the clinic now, not with patients she had to look after, but she couldn't ignore Emma either. Meanwhile, at the mill, Emma stood still, every sense heightened, as the wind howled through the cracks in the old structure. Her breath was shallow, the cold gnawing at her, but she had to finish her task. The mill had always been more than just a building to her. It was a symbol of everything her family had sacrificed for. Her father's legacy was in the bones of this place, and she couldn't leave it in such a state. The strange whistling sound had stopped, but now there was another noise, a deep, grinding creak, as if the mill itself was complaining under the weight of the snow. Emma's heart raced. She had no choice but to move forward. Her mission was simple: check the integrity of the mill's old machinery. The winter winds had caused the wooden structure to shift over the years, and it was now on the brink of collapse. As she moved into the heart of the mill, She could hear the telltale sounds of beams straining under pressure. The building was becoming more unstable by the second. Emma's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, squinting at the small screen through the mist of her breath. A message from Hannah. "Please get out of there. The storm's getting worse. Come back now. It's not safe." Emma's stomach tightened. She knew Hannah was right. She had overstayed her welcome, and the storm was becoming a beast she couldn't tame. But as she turned toward the door, there was another sound, this time a loud crack. A beam, weakened by the relentless snow and wind, had finally given way. The entire side of the mill groaned, and before Emma could react, the ground beneath her shifted. She stumbled, barely catching herself against the cold stone wall. The wind howled louder outside now, and Emma realized she wasn't going to make it out of here as easily as she thought. The storm was now at its peak, and each person in Pine Ridge was being tested. Emma's situation at the mill had just escalated, and the rest of the town wasn't faring much better. As the hours wore on, the cold was no longer just an inconvenience. It was becoming a threat that no one, no matter how prepared, could take lightly. Ben Thorne was doing everything he could to keep control of the town in the midst of the chaos. His patrol car slowly made its way through the nearly impassable streets, the visibility nearly zero. He could barely see the red and blue lights flashing ahead, signaling the location of a downed tree blocking the main road near the western outskirts of town. The storm had definitely taken its toll. Cars had skidded off roads. There were already reports of people trapped in their homes due to power outages and blocked roads. His team had set up a makeshift command center at the fire station, but they weren't even sure if they'd be able to get out of the hardest hit areas. As Ben approached the fallen tree, he felt a deep sense of dread in the pit of his stomach. The snow had been falling in near whiteout conditions for hours now, and the temperature had dropped even further. The wind was howling, pushing the snow sideways and making it feel like it was slashing against his face. He stepped out of the car, the cold biting into his skin like 1,000 needles. He could barely hear the crackle of the radio through the storm. His deputy Steve had made it through the worst of the roads, but Ben wasn't sure how much longer they'd be able to stay outside in these conditions. "Sheriff, we've got to clear this tree and get roads open," Steve shouted, his voice nearly drowned by the wind. "But I don't think anyone's going to make it out here tonight." Ben nodded, feeling the weight of that truth settle on him. This wasn't just about clearing roads or checking on people anymore. The storm had become an all-consuming force, one that made everything feel small and insignificant in comparison. "We'll get it done, Steve," Ben said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty swirling around him. "But we need to head back to the fire station after this. People need shelter, and we can't keep pushing our luck out here. It's too dangerous." Hannah Green knew the storm had reached its peak when she started hearing faint cries from the hallway. At first she thought it was just the wind, but as she moved toward the door, the cries grew louder. A man had been brought in with severe frostbite, and his fingers were already nearly black from the cold. "Get him to a bed now," Hannah barked, as two nurses helped move the man into one of the rooms. She grabbed the man's chart. "Who's his emergency contact?" His wife was on the phone when one of the nurses answered. "She's stuck at home. Tree down, power's out." Hannah's stomach tightened. She tried to concentrate on the patient, applying what little medical supplies they had left to save his fingers, but the weight of the storm was crushing. She had seen so many injuries today. She could barely keep up with the influx of cases, and yet there was no escape from the relentless cold outside. She finished wrapping the man's hand. Her phone buzzed again. It was Emma's message telling her she was still at the mill. Hannah stared at the screen, the reality sinking in. Emma wasn't safe. She was alone at the mill, in the heart of the storm, and Hannah couldn't shake the fear that her friend might not make it back. Peter and Mary Thompson had reached the outskirts of town, barely able to see through the wall of snow in front of them. The wind had become a beast, howling and screeching as it whipped around them. Peter was already struggling, his breath labored in the freezing air. Mary, bundled in layers of clothes, clung to her husband's arm, trying to keep up, but the storm made it feel like they were trudging through waist-high snow. The clinic was just a few more miles, but it felt like a lifetime. "We can't keep going, Peter," Mary gasped, her voice shaking from the cold. We need to turn back. This isn't safe. Peter stopped, his breath visible in the air. He looked at her, his face grim. I know, but if we don't get there now, we'll never make it. The storm's only getting worse. Mary's heart raced. They had to get to the clinic. Everything else could wait. But just as she opened her mouth to argue, a distant crack split the air, a sound that made her freeze in place. From behind them, the thundering crash of a tree breaking in two echoed through the storm. The ground shifted beneath their feet. A large, heavy branch had fallen from the nearby pines, and it was now blocking the only way forward. Peter cursed under his breath. The storm wasn't just closing in on them, it was trapping them here. We have to go back, Mary. We can't make it. With heavy hearts, they turned around, heading back toward their farmhouse. The wind howled louder, and the snow continued to fall in sheets. Back at the mill, Emma had reached the point of no return. The building was shaking, the old wood groaning under the weight of the storm. The crack she had heard earlier had been followed by another deep, rumbling sound as part of the mill's structure began to collapse. The last of the beams had finally buckled under the relentless wind and snow. Emma's pulse quickened. The mill was no longer a safe place for her. It had become a death trap. As she tried to make her way toward the back exit, the ground beneath her shifted again. A large piece of ceiling timber came crashing down, nearly grazing her shoulder. She stumbled, barely catching herself against the crumbling wall. The wind howled louder outside now, a violent force that rattled the remaining windows of the mill. She had to move, and fast. Her phone buzzed again. Hannah's message was on the screen. Come back. It's not safe there. Come home now. But Emma's instincts told her there was no time to wait. The storm already taken control of the mill, and she had to escape before it took everything, including her life. With the storm pushing her forward, Emma ran toward the back door, but when she reached it, it was stuck. The snow outside had piled up so high, she couldn't even pry it open. Panic surged within her. The cold and wind were closing in, and she was trapped. Desperation set in. The mill was falling apart around Emma. The very walls that had once stood as symbols of her father's hard work now crumbling under the nature's brutal assault. With no way out through the door, Emma spotted a nearby window. It was high up, and she would have to climb, and the wind and the snow were relentless. She shoved the window open, wincing as the biting air hit her skin. There was no time to hesitate. Emma took a deep breath, her hands raw from the cold, and began to climb the rickety old shelves to reach the window's ledge. The mill groaned again, and with one final shove, Emma launched herself into the freezing air, her body hitting the snow outside. She was on the ground, her body aching from the fall, the biting cold seeping into her bones as she struggled to catch her breath. The wind whipped around her, blinding her, but she pushed herself to her feet, clinging to the remnants of the mill as though it were her last anchor to the world. The storm's fury raged around her, snow swirling in violent gusts that cut through her clothes and her skin. She knew she had only moments before the full weight of the storm would collapse on her. There was no time to waste. She looked around, her eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of shelter, anything to keep her safe. Through the whirling snow, she saw the faintest outline of the old shed just beyond the mill, an old storage building that had once housed tools. It was her only chance. With no other option, she stumbled toward it, each step feeling like it took every ounce of her remaining strength. Her boots slipped in the snow, and she fell, her hands scraping against the cold ground. She forced herself up again, determined to survive. "Come on, Emma, move," she muttered to herself through her gritted teeth, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. Just as she reached the shed, another gust of wind howled, pushing her back toward the snowbank. She gritted her teeth again, refusing to give in. With a final, desperate push, she reached the door of the shed, her fingers frozen to the metal as she fumbled for the handle. It creaked open. Inside, it was dark, but at least there was shelter. She slammed the door behind her and collapsed onto the cold floor, her body shuddering with exhaustion and bone-chilling cold. She was alive, but barely. Emma wrapped her arms around herself, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "I made it," she whispered to herself. "Now just hold on. Just hold on." Back in town, the storm was taking its toll. Ben Thorne had been patrolling the streets for hours now, moving from house to house, checking on anyone who might need help. His patrol car was now stuck also, buried under a few feet of snow as the wind howled around it. It was clear the storm was only intensifying, and power outages had left Pine Ridge in total darkness. People were huddled in their homes, trying to stay warm, while Ben and his team fought to keep roads open. The fire station was being used as an emergency shelter, but it was clear there wouldn't be enough space for everyone. Ben stood at the edge of the road, looking toward the horizon, where he knew the outskirts of town were buried under snow. He couldn't help but think of his family, his wife, his young daughter, safely at home waiting for him. The storm had taken on a life of its own, and every step forward felt like an impossible battle. His mind kept going back to the people in town, the elderly, the children, the ones out in the worst of it. They needed help, but it was almost too late. Then his radio crackled to life. "Sheriff Thorne," a voice said, "we've got reports of a person trapped at the mill. It's Emma. She's been in contact with her friend Hannah, but it looks like she's stuck out there in the storm." Ben's heart raced. The mill was on the far edge of town, too far to be reached on foot in these conditions. But Emma was a fighter, and if anyone could survive out there, it was her. "I'm on it," Ben replied, gritting his teeth. He's already moving, his boots crunching through the snow. He knew the risk. It wasn't safe out there, not with the storm reaching its peak, but he wasn't going to leave Emma to face it alone. At the clinic, Hannah's worst fears had become reality. The storm impact on the town had escalated. She had patients in every corner of the clinic, each one needing help. But it wasn't just the cold they were battling, it was the danger of being trapped. The clinic was out of power now, the backup generators flicking on and off. The radio reports of people stuck in the storm had flooded in among them. Emma's name stood out. "Hannah, you need to rest," one of the nurses told her with a voice full of concern. "You've been on your feet for hours now, and we're doing everything that we can here." Hannah shook her head, feeling the weight of the town's survival resting on her shoulders. She could feel the panic rising, the awareness that if they didn't act now, the storm would claim more than just homes. It could claim lives. "I can't rest, not while Emma's out there." Her phone buzzed again. She quickly checked the message. "Emma's trapped at the mill. She's been trying to get out." Hannah's breath caught in her throat. Emma, alone. She grabbed her coat, determined to find her friend. But as she opened the door, the wind slammed it into her, nearly knocking her off her feet. Snow blinded her vision, and she could barely hear anything over the roar of the storm. But she had no choice. She couldn't wait. Peter and Mary Thompson, having turned back from the clinic, had found themselves in the same predicament, trapped in their own home. The storm had grown fiercer as the evening wore on. The roads were blocked, and their farmhouse was now fully surrounded by snow. The power had gone out hours ago, and despite their best efforts, they couldn't get the fireplace going. "We're stuck, Peters," Mary said, her voice trembling. She was exhausted, her body aching. "We can't stay like this." Peter wrapped his arms around her, trying to shield her from the worst of it, but even his strong hands were shaking, the chill seeping into his bones. "Don't worry, though," his voice faltered a little. "We'll make it. We just need to get through tonight." But he knew that wasn't true. The storm was more than just a blizzard. It was a force they could not withstand for long. The storm had claimed the town, but it hadn't broken its spirit. As the winds howled and snow piled higher, the people of Pine Ridge fought against the storm with everything they had. Ben, Hannah, and the others had all made choices to step into the heart of the storm to help those who needed it most. Ben, struggling through the snow to the mill, found himself thinking of the town, his people. Emma was counting on him, but the storm was relentless. Every step was a battle. Then, in the distance, he saw a figure. It was Emma. She was staggering toward him, her clothes soaked and her body covered in snow. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with determination. Ben, she gasped, her voice barely audible over the wind. I thought I was done for. Ben reached her, his heart pounding. Without a word, he threw his arm around her, pulling her close. You're not done for. You are not alone. As the storm roared around them, Ben guided her back toward town, where shelter and safety waited. As the storm began to ease, the wind calmed, and the snow settled into an eerie silence. The town of Pine Ridge, battered and exhausted, had survived the worst of it. Homes were buried, power was still out in many places, but the worst of the storm's fury had passed. The people who had weathered the storm now stood together, stronger for the hardships they had endured. Emma, finally safe in the arms of her friend Hannah, leaned against the clinic wall, the warmth of the fire behind them beginning to thaw her frozen limbs. She was exhausted, but she was alive, surrounded by friends and neighbors who had come together to help. You're not alone, Emma, Hannah said, and her voice filled relief. We're all here. Emma smiled faintly, tears blurring her vision. She could hardly believe it. The storm had taken everything, every sense of safety, every ounce of security, but in the process, it had also brought out the best in people. Out in the streets, Ben Thorpe had his team had helped clear roads, bringing food and supplies to those who were still stranded. His patrol car had broken down hours ago, but Ben never stopped pushing forward, rescuing those he could, guiding the lost back toward the shelter. Now the fire station was full with people gathering together in warmth, and the storm had become a distant memory in the face of the town's unity. Peter and Mary Thompson had opened their farmhouse to their neighbors, offering what little they had left. There was no room for hesitation. The storm had shown them undeniable truth that no one could survive it alone, and that's what had all kept them all alive. As the town began to rebuild, one by one, people helped one another, digging out driveways, checking in on elderly neighbors, sharing hot meals. The snow that had once isolated Pine Ridge now served as a bond, drawing them closer. The storm had forced them into a shared struggle, but in that shared hardship, they had found something powerful, a sense of community, a realization that they were all here for each other. Ben Thorne stood outside the fire station looking out over the town. The storm had been merciless, but as he looked around, he saw something that gave him hope. The people of Pine Ridge had come together when it mattered the most. They haven't given up on one another, and that, he thought, was the most powerful force of all. We're all here to help one another. Together, we are stronger. The spirit of the holidays had never felt more alive, despite the cold, despite the danger, despite the unrelenting storm. The people of Pine Ridge had reminded each other of the truth that lived at the heart of every community. No one is truly alone. And in that truth, they found warmth, hope, and the strength to face whatever lay ahead. Happy holidays, Pine Ridge, and happy holidays to all of you. Thank you for listening and or watching, and have a great night at work.